So, welcome to probably the most comprehensive camera test I've ever done on this channel. We're currently using the selfie cameras on each of the phones and also the respective microphones on whichever one I'm talking on. Now, you'll probably notice that two of the phones on the left-hand side are the Pocophone F1 and the Vivo V11, phones that aren't really in the same price tag as the Galaxy Note 9. And the reason for that is that both of those phones have cameras that defy the price tag, so we're going to see just how close they can get. And starting off with video from the front camera, you'll notice that all three phones have a slightly different color profile. The V11 and the Note 9 I'd say are both a step above the Poco F1 here. Mind you, even the F1's footage is pretty good, but it's just a little bright, and if you compare the white t-shirt on all three phones, you'll notice that the V11 and the Note 9 managed to keep it from overexposing. When we move to front-facing photos though, the story gets more interesting. In my full review I talked about how I don't think I've tried a phone which can take better selfies than the V11. And you can probably tell here, whereas the Poco F1 and the Note 9 have severely overexposed the t-shirt, with the V11 you can still see the stitches. The V11 also wins in dynamic range. It manages to properly represent both the really bright areas of the image, for example the t-shirt, and the really dark areas, for example the black door in the background. Then we've got selfie focus, aka front-facing portrait mode, and you can probably tell the Pocophone F1 is by no means subtle. I think the V11 and the Note 9 have a slightly more realistic bokeh effect, but if you look at my hair on the Note 9, it's pretty much treated it as background. Yet again, the Note 9 doesn't do a particularly good job realizing that the car behind me is actually part of the background, so that remains in focus. And something that I thought was pretty cool with the V11 is that when you're taking selfie focus photos like this, you can add a rainbow effect, or alternatively, monochrome background. As the light starts to fade, I'd say the Poco F1 has the sharpest front-facing camera. If you look at the V11, you can see noticeable grain starting to creep in, and if you look at the Note 9, it's just a little soft. And for fun really, I took it a step further and went to super low light. And the trend is pretty consistent. In terms of front-facing photos, the Note 9 doesn't keep up very well. The V11 also has a brightness compensation mode, which does a better job than the other two phones' flashes at lighting up your face, but unfortunately doesn't remove the grain from the background. And now we're at it. This is probably as good as we're going to get for a microphone test. So we're going to flick between the audio of all three phones, and you tell me which one you think sounds better. So now we're testing the audio from the Pocophone F1. So what do you think, is that better or worse than the last one? And now the Galaxy Note 9, which you would expect given the immense price difference between these phones to of course have the best audio quality and the lowest background noise. Alright, we've spent enough time talking about the front-facing cameras, so onto the rear. And for this, the V11 for some strange reason only caps out at 1080p video, which is poor considering phones with an equivalent chipset can do 4K. It does make up for it in terms of photos, which we'll get to in a minute, but if we look at video in isolation, the V11 is generally a disappointment. So with the phone set to 4K, apart from the V11, you can see that when it comes to stabilization, the Galaxy Note 9 has a massive advantage. Compared to the shaky mess that is the V11 or the Poco F1, the Note 9 almost looks like you've got your phone on a slider, and it's just gliding through the environment. Something else worth pointing out though is that the dynamic range on the Poco F1's video is amazing, and actually I'd say better than the Galaxy Note 9's. If we put all three phones at 1080p video, then I'd say the Galaxy Note 9 is still winning it, but the gap between this and the Pocophone F1 has definitely narrowed. In terms of slow motion, the Note 9 wins. This comparison should give you a pretty good idea of how much difference there is between those other two phones' 240fps and the Note 9's 960. Now, the Note 9 can't record at this super high frame rate consistently, it can only do it for a short period of time, but if you prefer to have slow motion like the other two phones continuously, then the Note 9 can do that too. Autofocusing was pretty fast on all three, actually tough to distinguish which phone does it faster, but if you look at the Note 9, it's definitely handled better. The transition between focusing on this close and this far object is much smoother than the slightly jerky V11 and Poco F1. Also notice how blown out the colours are on the F1. In most cases I do prefer the extra saturation it adds, but obviously in cases like this, it has gone a little overboard. Okay, photos, and for this next little section, all the phones are going to be using their HDR modes, and while you can probably tell the Note 9 and the F1's photos look pretty similar, the V11's look completely different. That phone's HDR mode works by bringing the shadows up significantly and bringing the lighter areas down, to almost create a neutral looking photo, but it's not in a bad way. You could argue it's the least realistic of the three, but at the same time it keeps the detail in the skies whilst also making the details in the previously dark areas really rather visible. So some people would argue it looks better. Now the Note 9 has the luxury of being a higher end phone, which gives it the option for a telephoto lens, which means you can zoom in 2 times and pretty much suffer minimal detail loss. So if we now crop into the already zoomed image, you can see the fact that the Note 9 has lossless zoom like this is playing to its advantage. And in this specific case scenario, the V11 has less noise per pixel than the F1. Now, one image that I think makes a really interesting comparison is this macro shot here. While the sky has completely disappeared on the V11 and the F1, you can pretty clearly see the details on the Note 9. And you might be thinking, wait a sec, that's the exact opposite of what was happening before. The V11 was meant to be doing better at keeping the sky under control and not overexposing. Well, what seems to be happening is this. The Vivo V11 has a really amazing HDR algorithm for both the front and the rear cameras. But in those cases where you can't use this HDR mode, for example in macro photos like this, or in terms of video, then the V11 seems to suffer. Meanwhile, the Note 9 has a variable aperture function, which means that in broad daylight, it can close up its aperture so it doesn't let too much light in. But this also comes with the disadvantage of getting less of that lovely bokeh effect. So if you look at the car number plate in the background, it's much less blurred out on the Note 9. Portrait mode, and here the V11 is back on top. Whereas the F1 and the Note 9 have a real faded look to them, the V11 remains punchy and contrasty. I wouldn't say there's any clear winner for edge detection. Literally every other image I took there was a different result, but one thing that is clear and very annoying is that with the Note 9's live focus mode, it zooms in to the image, which basically means you have to take 3 or 4 steps back to actually take the same photo. Because the V11's primary sensor has an f1.8 aperture versus the f1.9 of the Pocophone F1, low light shots tend to favour that device. But let's not forget that when things get really dim, the Note 9 is still in a different league altogether. Being able to open up its aperture to f1.5, it can make some really dark scenarios almost look like a completely different time of the day. And now to answer, for some people, the most important question, detail. Well, all 3 phones have a 12 megapixel primary sensor, and cropping into them, they're pretty much the same. Each of course has its own color profile, and I would say the V11 and the Note 9 have a slightly cleaner, slightly less noisy image than the Pocophone F1, but detail is pretty much the same. Okay, so which one do you think represents the best value for money when it comes to camera? Bear in mind the V11 is around the $400 mark, the POCO F1 about the $330 to $350 mark, and the Note 9 about $1,000. Thanks a lot for watching guys, my name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you guys next time.